As Canada and the U.S. continue to navigate a new reality in regards to their trading relationship, Ottawa is seeking to improve trading relationships with other countries, including Mexico, whose leader will be hosting Prime Minister Mark Carney next week. Mexico's Claudia Sheinbaum will meet with Carney on Thursday for a new round of trade talks with an emphasis on Canada's investment in areas including Mexican mining, gas, and rail. Canadian ministers visited Mexico City last month to prepare for Carney's visit.
Canada and Mexico, they recently did a move that was supposed to give them leverage against President Trump's, unpredictable trade tactics and how he uses tariffs and sanctions, and it just sends, all other nations reeling economically and putting America in a real nice situation. That's the whole point of Trump's tactics. And on paper, it looks smart. Two of North America's biggest economies sitting down, discussing strategy, aligning their approach to counter America's disruptions, but almost immediately cracks started to appear. It was meant to be a show of strength, and it revealed vulnerabilities. Okay, it exposed both countries to risks they might not have fully anticipated. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is scheduled to meet Mexico's president in Mexico City. The focus of the talks is clear: trade, investment, aligning their goals. Canada wants to expand its involvement in Mexico's mining sector, gas production, and rail infrastructure. And Canadian ministers, they've already been in Mexico City, laying the groundwork and signaling that Ottawa is serious about deepening the partnership. Now, on the surface, it's a very straightforward diplomatic mission. It's a chance to solidify ties, build united front, yada yada yada. But the stakes are actually really complicated. Canada and Mexico, they already have trade agreements in place. There's the USMCA, which governs much of North American trade, and the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which also includes both countries. In other words, guys, there's already market access that's already there. Carney and Sheinbaum, they aren't negotiating a brand new deal. Their goal is more strategic. They try to unite with each other because the United States is beating them down pretty good right now. That's the real thing. That's what's going on. Particularly, they're trying to get some strength in the auto sector because it's highly complex. All right, this auto market. All right, because the tangled nature of North American trade with vehicles, they cross border a dozen times or more during production and moving parts, components between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Any disruption in that supply chain, it doesn't hurt just manufacturers. It goes to workers, suppliers, consumers. So, by lining up policies and responses between the two, it seems smart for Mexico and Canada.
With relations between Canada and the U.S. still strained by Donald Trump's tariffs, the government is looking to bolster its economic and political ties with Mexico. Now, last month, Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke to Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum by phone. And this past week, he sent down two of his cabinet ministers, with Finance Minister François Champagne and Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand, to Mexico to meet with her in person.
But it also draws attention to Canada's reliance on a relationship that is fundamentally mediated by Big Brother by the United States. That's where the twist comes in. While the meeting shirts meant to strengthen Canada's hand, but it reveals a vulnerability. By coordinating so closely with Canada, Mexico exposes strategic intentions with Canada, and Canada also it reveals its intentions. Like both nations are now revealing their hand and opening themselves up to criticism and potentially retaliation. And we know Trump's a counterpuncher. You hit me, I hit you back kind of guy. That's what he does. So, it's probably going to happen. Trade partners are going to probably question whether Canada is pivoting too soon, too heavily, too aggressively. That could complicate existing commitments under the CPTP. That was intended as a protective alliance, and now it's carrying its own risks. The stakes are high even beyond autos, mining, gas, rail investments that represents billions of dollars in long-term economic influence. Canada's presence in these sectors is intended to diversify trade exposure. Reducing dependence on the United States at a moment when Washington's policies are unpredictable for the rest of the world. But diversification is a very delicate balancing act. Deepening ties with Mexico is only one piece of a broader strategy that must also be considered. Because you got to think about Europe, Asia, the UK, and if Canada, Mexico can present a united front, it strengthens their position when dealing with Washington. But at the same time, unity can be a double-edged sword. Trade lawyers emphasize that the meeting's immediate goal is practical. It's not legislative. Robert Glasgow, an international trade lawyer, has pointed out that the discussions aren't about creating new agreements. The large question is how much Canada can afford to rely on Mexico. Diversification requires a web of partners. The CPTP, for example, connects Canada with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and others, creating multiple avenues for trade outside the United States. Europe and the UK are also important. And in this context, the Canada-Mexico alliance is important, but it's not sufficient on its own. The meeting also serves a political function. By publicly coordinating, Carney and Sheinbaum demonstrate that their governments are proactive, not reactive. But the optics can cut both ways. Aligning too closely might be interpreted by Trump as a challenge or even a provocation. Even if diplomats don't intend it this way, the media might portray this as a strike against U.S. influence. So a partnership designed to lower risks might just add a whole new layer and more sanctions and tariffs on both parties. If Trump, Canada's strategy for diversifying trade relies on several layers. Mexico is one piece of the puzzle. CPTP partners across the Pacific add another. Europe, particularly the EU, brings, extra stability. And with the UK set to join the CPTP fully, Canada gains yet another path for trade resiliency. But because the Mexico meeting is so high profile, it draws a lot of attention, and the visibility can make the early backfire almost unavoidable. The alliance is front and center, while the broader diversification strategy remains less clear to the outside world. So moves that frustrate Washington, particularly Trump, can trigger tariffs, trade retaliations hitting Canadian exporters and sectors in Mexico, also the auto sector there. Like the alliance is trying to protect itself. But from a practical standpoint, the talks will zero in on immediate sectors. You got the mining, gas, and rail and aligning sectors, and also automotive trade. And beyond that, both sides will try to coordinate messaging towards Washington. If it works, it could smooth the way for a bilateral trade investment. But any misstep or any wrong headline or anything could provoke him into pushing back. And even with market access already secured under existing agreements, aligning policies and responses is not simple. Canada and Mexico have different domestic priorities, regulatory rules, and political pressures. Harmonizing all of that to present a united front is not easy to do in front of Washington. So if communication or strategy slips, the alliance could look fragile. And in a climate where Trump has already shown he can act unpredictable, even small missteps could translate into economic consequences. The stakes aren't just economic, they're political too. Canada wants to show both domestic and international audiences that it can safeguard its trade interest without relying entirely on the U.S. Mexico benefits as well, demonstrating it has partners ready to handle disruptions, but public perception can be weaponized. And with us today is international trade attorney John Boscario. Thank you, John, for joining us today. How are you? I'm good, Roger. Nice to be here. Roger, let's get right down to business. What can we reasonably expect from these follow-up meetings with Mexico? John, there are three main issues that we're watching closely in the talks between Prime Minister Carney and President Sheinbaum. Then, naturally, I would expect them to compare notes on their respective negotiations with the Trump administration. Mexico and Canada have both taken vastly different approaches in dealing with U.S. tariffs. As you will remember, Canada was the only nation besides China to retaliate against America directly. Mexico did not retaliate at all. Most recently, Canada reversed a large part of its retaliatory measures but continues to hold some duties on aluminum, steel, and motor vehicles. Mexico, however, has indicated that it plans to impose more duties on motor vehicles from other countries, specifically China and other regions of Asia, in the weeks ahead. Canada, conversely, is considering lifting its duties on electric vehicles imported from China. For Ottawa, even the token display of opposing U.S. interests can prompt an instant counterattack, adding still another layer of tension to an already delicate negotiating process. Ultimately, the coordination between Mexico and Canada is evidence of a new North American reality in trade. Dependence on the United States alone is dangerous. Alignment with Mexico is a forward-thinking initiative. But the increased profile of this alliance unavoidably brings political visibility, media scrutiny, and a very real risk of resistance in Washington. That, in my opinion, is the logical result of practicing diplomacy so openly in a high-visibility, high-stakes environment. The true test for both governments will be how well they can reconcile these conflicting pressures. Before Prime Minister Carney and President Sheinbaum ever sit down together, both sides will have done their research. Canadian and Mexican ministers have already been in Mexico City working on preparatory meetings, going through investment plans, priorities, trade flows, and possible areas of disagreement. The goal is to go into these negotiations with a concerted strategy that will effectively address the short-term issues, as well as look to the future with a strategic vision. For audiences, the key message is simple. Canada and Mexico are seeking to turn possible weaknesses into an asset. But any negotiation done in Washington's eye, particularly with President Trump's fame for off-script counterpunching, is certain to lay bare strategies, put weaknesses on display, and call into question the commitments of each nation to the other partners. Canada's own initiative is not just economic. It's also highly political. Ottawa is attempting to show both at home and abroad that it can stand up for its own interests without relying solely on the United States. Mexico benefits in the same way by proving it has reliable partners willing to assist in stabilizing disruptions. But the visibility of this summit requires both governments to move cautiously. What appears simple on the face of it is, in fact, a subtle balancing act. In a sense, the backfire part of this tale has been in plain sight from the start. An action intended to be straightforward and tactical has already revealed many risks before the first handshake is even made. Markets, media, and political analysts are all paying close attention. Backing Mexico could very much pay off in some places, but it also highlights just how delicate the strategy is. It depends on cross-border cooperation in an unstable environment with the United States squarely between. For now, Ottawa and Mexico City are moving slowly, knowing that each word, each handshake, and each policy announcement will be analyzed to the nth degree. The Carney-Sheinbaum conference may yield concrete deals, or perhaps it will only be used to deliver a political message. Either way, it's a sharp reminder of the way complicated trade relationships are when your biggest partner, the United States, is more seasoned, more calculating, and frequently one step ahead. Canada's diversification strategy remains a work in progress in a number of ways. Further integration with CPTPP partners in the Pacific, returning attention to Europe and the UK, and a variety of bilateral investment initiatives. Mexico is a critical part of this strategy, but is by no means the sole piece of the puzzle. The initial indications of Backfire demonstrate that even wisely designed coalitions entail great dangers, especially under intense scrutiny from the public and media. What could start out as a straightforward arrangement can soon become a tale of political optics, media spin, and the ever-present dilemma of keeping several partners in step at once while the United States looks on from above. As Prime Minister Carney heads into this meeting, both governments will have to balance far more than the nuts and bolts of trade. They have to think about how each move looks to domestic constituencies, how it's seen in the rest of the world, and, most critically perhaps, how Washington will respond. This partnership is unquestionably high-profile and ambitious, and it is every bit as much about politics and perception as it is about economics, strategy, and scope. Even one wrong step might trigger a domino effect able to drastically upset industries throughout North America. Thanks for tuning in to Next Truth Report. What do you think of today's news? Let me know below. I read every single one. If you like this update, like the video and subscribe so you never miss our new breaking news and analysis. Thanks for watching the Next Report.